Okay, so today we're going to quick talk about language. This will wrap up some of our discussions of higher order cognition for the semester. We'll talk later about decision making and reasoning. Language is obviously an important cognitive function. We're going to be talking about basic introductions to language and some of the basic terminology and ways in which we conduct research into language. Just a very basic introduction to the topic, talk a little bit about discourse, and then we'll finish up talking about brain and language. But linguistics is the academic study of language, and psycholinguistics is the study of how people learn to use language, learn and use language, excuse me. Plenty of linguistics faculty here at Georgetown. They certainly are experts in this field. This is an area I know a little bit about. But we're going to primarily just take a basic look at how people learn and use languages. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what really is language? And language is just simply a shared symbolic system of communication, which can be spoken, written, or gestural. So for example, obviously English is both a spoken and written language, but we also have American Sign Language, which is a gestural language. Of course, we know some languages were primarily written, things like hieroglyphics. We don't know exactly how that was spoken, for example, or is it just simply a written language. But it's just this shared symbolic system of communication. And there are many, many different ways in which language can develop, some of which have common roots, some of which have independent roots. Of course, we've talked about things like the quote-unquote Romance languages, which are all generally descended from Latin, things like Italian, French, Spanish, English. All of those generally evolved from the basic Latin roots. So it's an important part of human history and certainly an important human skill. There are a number of universals of language that we're going to talk about today. Every language will have all of these components. The first of these is semanticity, which simply means that a language will convey meaning. The second is arbitrariness. There's really no inherent connection between the symbols and their meaning. It is just simply because we have basically agreed that these are the words that will mean these things. So, as Shakespeare, of course, said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So there is an absolute arbitrariness to the connection between the symbols and their meaning. And there certainly is the same thing with gestural languages. There is some connection between some gestures and their meaning, but there are different sign languages, so there's just American Sign Language, and so it demonstrates there is certainly an arbitrariness to the connections even there. The third universal of language is the flexibility of symbols. We can change connections and invent new connections. Certainly we invent new words, we combine new words. Email, for example, it didn't exist when I was a kid, so we didn't know of the word email. We change what we view a word to mean. Words change meaning all the time, and so that's an important part of language. Naming is another universal language. We just simply assign names to things, which is how they end up being called what they are. Finally, displacement, which is the ability to talk about other moments in time, like the past and future. So language allows us to talk about our past and talk about our future and think about our past and future. And then finally, productivity. Language is itself a creative process. We produce language rather than reproduce it. That is, each time we speak, write, form a sentence, we are creating language. Unless we've memorized something, we are creating that language each time. And so it's a pretty remarkable thing that we can do so quickly, is to create language that quickly and combine words into meaningful sentences most of the time and produce cohesive language. So these are the universals of language: semanticity, arbitrariness, flexibility of symbols, naming, displacement, and productivity. I want to talk a little bit about how we analyze language. First, all languages have grammar. This is just the basic rules for stringing things together to make language. What's interesting about grammar is we develop an intuitive sense of grammar. We don't have to be taught grammar. We're taught the rules of appropriate grammar and how to diagnose grammar and the parts, but we actually have an intuitive understanding of what a sentence is supposed to sound like. And we know when it's wrong without having to be able to say, well, that's the wrong participle, or you have a dangling modifier. Without knowing the words for it, we simply know that it's incorrect. Phonology refers to the rules of the sounds of language. Syntax refers to word order and its grammaticality. So each language has its own phonology. So we have combinations of sounds that are unique to each language. Some are shared across languages, but for example, we have a hard R sound in our language, whereas many languages have no hard R sound. And as a result, people that try to learn English have a difficult time saying that wrong, for example, river. That hard R sound is difficult for many people to learn how to do, much like when you learn French, Spanish, you do that rolling R. In Germanic languages and Russian languages, there's a lot of hard consonant sounds that we're not used to making, and so it takes us a while to learn those sounds. And then finally, the lexical or semantic rule of language is basically word meanings and the integration of word meanings. When we talk about the lexicon, we're talking about our body of knowledge about words and what they mean. So phonology is the sounds. Syntax is the way in which we put things together to make sentences. And then finally, the lexical aspects of language are how we associate word and integrating word meaning. When we talk about the conceptual analysis of language, we're talking about analysis with reference to knowledge, whereas belief is reference to our own belief and beliefs about a speaker's intent. So for example, if somebody says the capital of Maine is Bangor, and you know that it's actually Augusta, that's conceptual knowledge. Versus belief is something like, I don't believe that vaccines cause autism. I don't believe that. I know that. But some people believe differently, and so that's your own beliefs. And also sometimes we have infer belief based on a speaker's intent. And so oftentimes when you're watching, for example, a politician, you might have some belief about their intent, and that shapes how we perceive that language. So language is a really important part of understanding our social interactions. In addition to, it's an important cognitive skill. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the phonology, or the basic sounds of language. So, phonemes are the basic sounds of language. They're are individual sounds that make up our language that are strung together into words, in coherent words. The first phonemes are consonant sounds. 3 variables contribute to our ability to make consonant sounds. The first is the place of articulation, which is where in the vocal tract the flow of air is disrupted. So for example, sound is at the back of the vocal tract, where a t is at the front. The manner of articulation, how is the airflow disrupted? Harshly, like t, versus g or for example. Voicing then is the timing of vocal cord vibrations. So again, all of these variables go into making different consonant sounds, and we learn very early on how to make that happen. Vowel sounds occur when there is no disruption of airflow. They're simply made based on the placement in the mouth, the front, center, or back, ah, or e, and our tongue position in the mouth, high, ye, or ah, ooh, for example, all based on placement in the mouth and tongue position. So different sounds are made based on place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing if it's a consonant, placement in the mouth, and our tongue position in the mouth if it's a vowel sound. We combine phonemes then into words, and there are rules for combining phonemes into words. We know what a word is supposed to sound like. We know that some phonemes don't come next to one another. Our extensive knowledge of these rules is what we call our phonemic competence, and we have a remarkable ability to perceive language, even though it's extraordinarily variable. So while everyone's voice is a little bit different, we perceive it as language. We certainly understand different accents, Sometimes we might have difficulty. When I lived in South Carolina, I would often talk about my redneck to English dictionary. But we call this the problem of invariance, is that we hear the same language, because they all are very similar, even though everyone speaks just a little bit differently. So it's pretty remarkable that we can understand how so many different people speak, given how different everyone sounds. So this problem of invariance is really pretty interesting. We also overlap phonemes when we speak. This is called co-articulation. We don't speak one phoneme at a time. We don't say co-articulation. We say co-articulation. We overlap them. One flows right into another. Excuse me. Syntax is the next important part of understanding language, and this is, of course, word order, how we put words together to form meaningful words and phrases. So sentences are more than just collections of words, and we certainly know if you get words out in the wrong order, you can end up with what we call word salad. So English really relies heavily on word order to convey meaning, probably far more so than in other languages, because you can use word order in so many different ways in English. So for example, red fire engine is one thing. Fire engine red is another, and a red engine fire is something else completely. Same three words, three different orders, result in three entirely different meanings. Phrase order excuse me, is the ordering of larger word units, and this can also influence meaning. So for example, Bill told the man to deliver the piano on Monday. So Bill's expecting his piano on Monday, versus Bill told the men on Monday to deliver the piano. Now we don't know when the piano is going to come. We just know that Bill told them on Monday. So again, same phrases, we've just simply rearranged them a little bit and we get completely different meanings. So it's important to understand that word order and phrase order have a great deal to do with how we process word meaning and how our language goes into the syntactical order and results in different meanings. So word order and phrase order are particularly important in the English language. An important part of understanding how syntax works is understanding how we go from creating an abstract representation to an actual sentence. And Noam Chomsky's come up with this great way of thinking about this, and it's Chomsky's Transformational Grammar. And Chomsky states that there are three different structures to language: surface, phrase, and deep structure. The surface structure is simply the surface of the sentence as it's spoken and or written. So it's just simply the sentence as we see it or hear it. The phrase structure then is the underlying structure of a sentence based on meaningful phrases. So for example, in the sentence, the dog chased the bicycle, we have two phrases. We have the dog and chase the bicycle. And so those are the individual phrases that have meaning on their own, which then combined results in a different meaning. And then finally, the deep structure is an abstract representation of the meaning of a sentence. And here's again where oftentimes the deep structure of a sentence is conveyed through things like tone and the way a statement is said. So oftentimes spoken language has a more impactful deep structure, or certainly is able to convey its deep structure in a way different from written language. And, the difference between the representation in a text message versus a phone conversation. Text messages have surface structure and phrase structure, but their deep structure is missing a little bit compared to having an actual conversation, because we learn a lot about the intent and the abstract meaning based on the way in which people communicate orally. So under this transformational grammar, there are transformational rules, basically the way in which we convert our deep structure into surface structure to produce language. So we know what we want to say, that's the deep structure, and then these transformational rules are how we convert that into language, how we say a sentence, write a sentence, etc. So all of this occurs by taking what we mean to say and hopefully converting it into a surface structure that resembles what we meant to say. Now, the problem with language is it's a two-sided coin. We have somebody producing language and somebody perceiving language. And I think we all know that there can be some errors in communication, and that's just simply human nature. And this transformational grammar doesn't get to that issue, but it's important to understand what you meant to say isn't always what people hear. So while we all are experiencing the same surface structure, we may actually infer a different deep structure than what was intended. And I think it's always important to keep in mind. There are a variety of lexical and semantic factors to discuss with language. Our mental lexicon is our mental dictionary of words and their meaning. Morphemes are the smallest units of language that have meaning. Unhappiness, for example, has 3 morphemes. And so each individual unit of language might have meaning. So un is one morpheme, happy is another, and then ness, which is a state of being, is the 3rd morpheme. It's not very clear whether we access individual morphemes or morphemes, that's a whole different thing, individual morphemes, or if we process the entire word all as one perception. Not entirely clear how that works. We do know there's no evidence, for example, that someone might end up with an inability to perceive individual morphemes. It's usually whole words that people can't process or understand. In terms of our semantic knowledge and syntax, our knowledge can often override syntax in how we perceive and remember. So remember, whenever we process language, whenever we hear somebody say something, whenever we read something, our current knowledge can oftentimes alter how we perceive and remember. Our knowledge always influences our perception and memory of language. So it's always important to understand that our knowledge is often driving our perception. In fact, oftentimes we hear things differently because we fill in parts that we might have missed. We didn't hear something very well, and so we hear something completely different from what was said. And then oftentimes, of course, we infer meaning that's different from what was meant. So it's important to keep that in mind. Final note on language is just a quick discussion of discourse. Discourse is another area of language that I think is really interesting. This is really more how we speak and communicate with each other. It's more about communication, understanding meaning, and intent. So usually we're talking about both written and spoken languages can convey discourse. We have conversations that proceed generally smoothly due to some shared assumptions about how that discourse is going to proceed. So for example, there are basically 4 maxims that we talk about that we assume everyone understands because this is how conversations proceed. In theory, now not everyone gets these. Maxim of quantity, as much as needed to be informative, but no more than needed. Don't overspeak. Quality, say only what you believe to be true. Relation, make your contribution relevant. Manner, be clear and brief to the point. So this is how high-quality discourse occurs, is when we follow these assumptions and we follow these kinds of rules. And that's how we're able to engage in more meaningful dialogue. And again, we call that discourse. So that's a brief introduction to kind of some of the topics around language. There's a lot more to language. I just wanted to provide a brief introduction to the topic. There are far greater experts in this area at the university for you to rely on. I do want to briefly talk about the brain and language. This is an important area of understanding understanding how language works. So we're going to first start talking about aphasia. Aphasia is the disruption of language by a brain-related disorder. It's usually a stroke, usually due to damage to the left hemisphere. Again, people that are left-handed often have more bilateral language centers than people who are right-handed. But usually we're talking about damage to the left hemisphere, which can result in specific damage to the language systems. So when we talk about aphasia, this is a general language disorder. there are some specific disorders we're going to talk about, primarily Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. Broca's aphasia is difficulty in language production. Wernicke's aphasia is difficulty in language comprehension. So we have several different kinds of aphasia to talk about. Again, Broca's aphasia is difficulty in speech production and syntactic features. This is due to damage in the frontal, sort of the frontal temporal junction, right near the motor areas. This is actually part of the supplementary motor area. So when we're talking about speech production, it's a motor difficulty, so they're unable to create the appropriate motor plans. Wernicke's aphasia is difficulty in comprehension, so inability to comprehend language. Conduction aphasia is an inability to repeat words back to someone. So there's just a disconnection between Broca's and Wernicke's area somehow. Anomia we talked about already. This is generally just a loss in nouns, so it's an inability to name things or find the appropriate noun. Pure word deafness is a disruption in the perceptual processing of auditory word comprehension, so they just simply can't hear whole words. This is the sort of related disorder to alexia. Alexia is often called word blindness, and so it's an inability to read or recognize printed letters. And then finally, agraphia is an inability to write. And agraphia can come up in a variety of different ways. People can lose the ability to write because they are apraxic, which is a loss of voluntary action or skilled motor movement. That's not agraphia. Agraphia is an inability to write, to actually genuinely write letters or write words. What's interesting is people can be alexic but not agraphic. So they can write, but then they won't be able to read what they've just written. So it's a pretty remarkable disruption and pretty difficult for people. Acalculia seems to be related to some of the language areas, but it's a disruption in mathematical abilities, which is sort of the symbolic part of the symbolic part of language. And then, of course, we've talked about agnosia and prosopagnosia already. So these different types of aphasia are associated with different parts of the brain, particularly Broca's area and Wernicke's area are associated with their relative aphasias. So those are disruptions in language due to brain disease or usually stroke. I want to finally end with a little bit note about bilingualism, some really interesting emerging results in the differences in brains for bilingual adults. Bilingual adults recover more easily from strokes. They seem to show increased gray matter in structural MRIs. They have reduced rates of dementia and later onset of dementia symptoms, in particular Alzheimer's. Bilingual children show greater cognitive flexibility, and these benefits can be seen as early as 18 months. In fact, they retain the ability to perceive additional phonemes. So we're born with the ability to perceive all phonemes, and then as about age 6 months, we lose the ability to perceive phonemes for languages that aren't the ones that we grow up around. So people that are bilingual keep all of the phonemes from both languages that they're learning. So they hang on to more of those. So there's a lot of benefits to growing up bilingual. And so here's just a quick view of some of those. All right, that's a very quick introduction to language. If you have any questions, be sure to get in touch with me, and I will see you all on Thursday.